Well, hello, sweet people, and welcome back to my channel. If it's your first time here, welcome especially. I'm Sally, and I'm so glad you stopped by. If you happened to see last week's video, you would know that I mentioned that I had just started my sourdough starter back up. And so to mark the occasion, so to say, and really just for fun, I wanted to do a week of sourdough baking and make a video accordingly. So that's what we're doing today. I am sitting here with a cup of tea, recording this voiceover. It is a bit of a longer video because turns out trying to fit a whole week of sourdough baking into one video takes a little bit of time, but I think it's coming together quite nicely, so I hope you enjoy it. And we're gonna do this voiceover in one take because I have a dryer guy coming to help fix my dryer here shortly. So anyways, kicking off the week, I am making just some classic sourdough loaves. Now, if you want my method, well, it's not originally my method, but the method I follow from start to finish with really clear instructions, I'm going to link my sourdough video that is just dedicated to these loaves down in the description box. So you can head over that direction and check it out. But if you haven't made sourdough loaves before, it is incredibly simple. All it comes down to is flour, water, and salt. And of course you have your sourdough starter as well, but that sourdough starter is itself just flour and water and yeast from the environment that has been cultivated kind of in the flour, in the water. It's like the palette for growth. So anyways, you start out by combining, or at least I start out by combining some of my water. I leave some of it out in the short term or for a little bit, flour, my sourdough starter, and just those three components for the time being. I form this really shaggy dough, stirring it together, usually at this step just with a spoon. Sometimes I'll go ahead and get my hands in there. And this is what's called the autolyse step. You're starting to kind of develop the gluten in your bread. I just cover it. I let it sit like that for about 30 minutes. Different people do the autolyse differently, but this is what works really well for me. And then I come back and I add the rest of my water. So it was about 100 to 150 grams. And I will say that this batch, I think I overhydrated just a little bit. I am kind of adapting to the season here in Boise and just the different humidity that I'm used to, different elevation that I'm used to. So these weren't the most perfect loaves ever, but they were still incredibly tasty. And I'll talk about this in a minute. I think my sourdough starter still needed a bit of waking up. I'm working on troubleshooting that. It worked great for everything except for these loaves. And they just didn't rise and get quite as much oven spring as I would have loved. But again, they were still super tasty. And yeah, if you want that full method and like more of an in-depth explanation, go check out the video again in the description box. But here I have added my extra water. I've added my salt. And now I have to get in there with my hands and get all of that water and all of that salt really combined. For now, that's gonna sit. It's sitting for about 30 minutes until our first stretch and fold, and I'm actually getting started on another project, which are some sourdough discard crackers. And this is something I've been excited to make for a while, but I just haven't gotten around to. I love crackers. I love to have crackers on hand, but generally speaking, they are full of polyunsaturated fats and vegetable oils that I don't want to be putting in my body. And so they're super cheap and super easy to make at home with your sourdough discard. This recipe is from Alexandra's Kitchen. I'm going to link it below. I'll link all the recipes I follow below, but it's just your sourdough discard. I did use bubbly sourdough starter and it worked just fine as well. It is flour, salt, and butter. And you mix these together to form a ball. I mixed it with a spoon. I eventually got in there with my hands. And in a minute here, it's just gonna go into the fridge. I left it covered for about 24 hours because I wanted it to have time to ferment. One of the massive benefits of sourdough is that the fermentation of the grains makes them a lot more digestible. And people even who can't typically handle wheat can find, I mean, it just depends on the circumstances, but if you're not true celiac and just depending on those circumstances, people will find that they're able to handle sourdough, especially if it's been fermented for a longer period of time. And it also helps to break down the phytic acid, the anti-nutrients in in the dough, in the flour. And so it's just really beneficial if you have the time to let it ferment for a while. So this went into the fridge and I revisited it that night, and we're returning now to the loaves. So I'm going in for my second stretch and fold now. Just go around the bowl about 4 times for a total of about 8 pulls. And here I have clipped together like my next 3 stretch and folds. So if you look kind of closely, you can just see the texture of that dough changing as the gluten develops, and it just gets smoother, it gets stretchier. I love this part of the process because I think it's just really neat to see it happening, feel it happening with your own eyes. And even if you're not someone who wants to bake sourdough full time, like if you want to bake yeast bread, totally fine, to each their own. I sometimes also bake yeast bread. I think it's worth going through the process so that you can become more familiar just with how dough changes, how it feels in your hands. Something my dad taught me from a really young age was like, you can't just base your baking on what the recipe says, but you need to develop a feel for it and be able to know if it's right based on your touch and based on how it looks. So, okay, now I'm showing you just how I'm feeding my sourdough starter. I had a genius idea, I'm just kidding, that I was going to just do a double feed in this jar because I have no spatial awareness, and I thought that it would fit, especially after it doubled, and that just wasn't true. So later I have to divide it into 2 jars, but I start off with about 30 grams of my existing sourdough starter. I generally like to just put it into a new jar because I find that it is the cleanest that way, but you can, use your old jar if you want. Anyways, put it in a new jar. I add about 125 grams of water, and I like to stir that into the existing starter initially because it's easier to combine them with the flour, and about 140 grams of flour is usually what I do. I stir that all up. I use water that's just slightly warm. You've probably seen me pouring with my kettle. I will heat it up just slightly in my kettle, and then I'll add some cold water to make sure it's not too hot, because if your water's too hot, it's gonna kill the yeast, and you absolutely do not want that. But my starter is currently tucked under my bathroom cabinet because there's a vent that goes up under there and it keeps it nice and warm in our houses. Otherwise, pretty chilly. And it really does need a warmer environment in order to thrive. Okay, so now I'm revisiting those crackers. This is later that night. I just cut my ball of dough in 2, and then I topped 1/2 of it with a little bit of avocado oil here. I like avocado oil because it has a pretty high smoke point, so it's a monounsaturated fat. It's not that polyunsaturated fat. Polyunsaturated fats aren't, evil across the board, but especially in a refined vegetable oil, they're already rancid. That's like dumping free radicals into your body. And you also, even if you have it in a whole form that's like been stored properly, you don't want to heat it because that's when it breaks down. And so anyways, avocado oil is just a great cooking oil with a bit of a higher smoke point. It has a higher smoke point than olive oil. It's a little bit less volatile, so I will kind of use that as my multi-purpose oil, and then I'll keep like a nicer olive oil for finishing or for like light sauteing. Sometimes I'll use it for roasting as long as I know it's not getting above the smoke point. But this is a total tangent. Okay, let's get back on track. So I rolled out my cracker dough. The key is to get it as even as possible. You want to get it pretty thin. It does take some elbow grease. Then I used my bench knife just to cut it into some little squares, rectangles, and I sprinkled everything but the bagel seasoning from Trader Joe's on this one. And then I did make another batch later where I just put pepper on those, and both turned out really well. I swear I usually don't like everything bagels. Like I really hate everything bagels. And so I've had everything but the bagel seasoning that I've hated. But recently I got it from Trader Joe's and I tasted it because Samuel was saying, I don't think this has the thing in it that you don't like, which I'm pretty sure it's like caraway seeds that I don't like. I may be mistaken, but it doesn't have it in it. So it's just like garlic and sesame seeds and some other stuff, and another tangent, but I'm confused because I'm like, I don't like everything bagels. There's something in there that is disgusting to me. And yet all of a sudden this seasoning doesn't have in it the thing that I don't like. Okay, next morning, once again, we are returning to our sourdough loaves. You can see here, that it is pretty wet. Again, I think I just put a little bit too much water in the dough, but it's still totally workable, and there's a lot of wiggle room when it comes to hydration. So I'm doing my bench rest right now, or shaping my loaves for their bench rest. We're starting to build surface tension here to help with oven spring. So I stretch the dough over itself, fold it in towards the center, then I kind of roll it up, and then to continue to build surface tension, once I have my bench nice and floured, I began to press it away from me and pull it in towards me. Again, a more detailed description of this process is in that full how to make sourdough video. So now I'm getting my bannetons or my proofing baskets ready. If you don't have these, you can just use a bowl, but they are very helpful. And if you're gonna make a lot of sourdough, they're worth investing in. Many people will use a towel and they'll just flour their towel very well. By the way, this is after the 30-minute bench rest. Oh my goodness. I'm repeating the process of shaping the dough to continue to build surface tension. And I prepared those bannetons not with a towel. I like to use parchment paper and set them into that parchment paper because I find that they're easier to get out with the parchment than they are with a towel. It sticks less. And you'll see how I do that. And I use the same parchment to bake them on a little bit later. Okay, so that is set to the side. I tucked it once again under my bathroom sink. Indication that my sourdough starter needs a little more TLC is that they never fully doubled or poofed up, and it was just taking hours in order for them to get to the point where I felt I was even ready to bake. They turned out really tangy, but again, they just didn't have the degree of beautiful lift that I would have loved. So anyways, we're working on the starter now. Okay, but this next recipe is from Farmhouse on Boone. I'm making her sourdough biscuits, and I'm making these to put on a chicken pot pie. Also her recipe, also linked below. I started off with, flour and butter, and you cut that butter into the flour. I just use my hands. I cut it up nice and small, use my hands, and then you're gonna add your salt, sugar, baking soda, baking powder. You're gonna whisk to combine. And next up, what we're gonna do is add our sourdough starter. And from there, you're going to add, she recommends buttermilk or kefir. I didn't have buttermilk or kefir. I could have made buttermilk, but I only had like raw milk, and I don't love to use this in recipes because it's expensive and it kind of defeats the point. So I use part yogurt and part milk, and it worked really well. And so Lisa at Farmhouse on Boone actually recommends that you don't add the baking soda and baking powder until the next day, but I just added it all at the same time, and they still poofed up really beautifully. These are actually the best homemade biscuits I've ever made, like sourdough or not. They got beautiful layers without me even having to try. So I will be returning to this recipe time and time again for the chicken pot pie and just to have on their own. But I mean, overall, aside from the addition of the sourdough starter, you're just treating them like normal biscuits. I covered it up, I popped it in the fridge, and it stayed in the fridge for, I think it was about 24 hours until the next night when I was prepared to use them. So now I have my loaves coming out of my bannetons. You saw that I just put my hand over it. I flip it upside down, and then I place it with the side that was on the bottom. You can tell by the ridges. Facing up. From here, I'm going to score my dough, and that's going to go into a preheated Dutch oven. Pretty much get your oven as high as you can get it. I have mine set to 500. It won't go any higher, but when I've had an oven that will go higher, I like to even heat it to like 550. You want it to preheat for ideally an hour, at least 30 minutes. I am placing this into the Dutch oven. We're going to cover it up, and it's going to go into the oven with the lid on for about 20 minutes, just like that. And I will say I like to put my loaves in the bannetons in the fridge. Even if I don't do the full second fermentation in the fridge, I like to have them in there for at least an hour before I bake, if possible, because it makes it, again, easier to get them out of the bannetons off that parchment paper, and they hold their shape a little bit better, at least for me. So after 15 minutes, I removed the lid. I didn't film this part, but I removed the lid. I reduced the heat to 450, and I bake it for another 20 minutes at 450 to develop nice color. So we did get some oven spring, but yeah, it didn't poof up all the way. It was still really yummy, and it's the next day. Okay, so this next morning I am making some sourdough pizza crusts because I thought it would be really fun to have a pizza night. Who doesn't love a pizza night? And bonus, when you can make it from scratch and everything in it is really and truly supportive to your body. So today, I think this recipe, I've tried a few different ones. I think this was from either The Clever Carrot or from Little Spoon Farm. It'll be linked below. I like both of those blogs, so I don't remember which one I used, but I'm just adding my flour, salt, avocado oil. They say olive oil, but I actually didn't have any olive oil right now, so I just used avocado, water. You add your sourdough starter, all to a stand mixer. You could absolutely do this by hand, but it does save a little bit of time and mess to use your stand mixer. Combine that thoroughly. I also made a huge mess with the flour. That's what I get for trying to pour it directly out of the jar. It got everywhere, so just cleaning that up. I found that this dough was way too wet, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of like developing a feel. Just practicing, especially with sourdough, getting your hands in the dough helps you to tell like, okay, this truly is too wet, or maybe it is a little bit too dry, and you can develop confidence to make adjustments from there. So I kept it pretty wet, but I did add some flour because I knew with time it was going to stiffen up. And the recipe says to do your stretch and folds and ferment it on the counter for, I think it was about 12 hours first, and then put it in the fridge overnight. I actually didn't do this. So I put it in the fridge right away. I kind of like reversed that process. I put it in the fridge right away, and then the next day I pulled it out and I began my stretch and folds, admittedly just because I wasn't paying attention and I forgot, but it totally worked just fine. Okay, so this is that same night, about 24 hours after I started those sourdough biscuits. I am going to go ahead and cut them out, and they're gonna go on top of my chicken pot pie. So I just smashed it down. I don't even have round cookie cutters. I just use a glass. I think I got 10 biscuits out of this. Actually, surprisingly, they were pretty thin by the time I cut them out because I was trying to stretch them to cover 2 pounds of the chicken pot pie. They're pretty thin, but they puffed up so much that it wasn't a problem at all, and I felt like they were the appropriate thickness. So a little trick, I always cut out as many as I can, and then when I have just a little bit of dough left over, I will just shape that into its own piece. So that's the chicken pot pie after it was baked. Turned out beautifully. It was delicious. Samuel wants me to make it all the time now. And he even said it was the best chicken pot pie he'd ever had, which we've had some really good chicken pot pie. So I'm very honored by that. Thank you, Lisa, at Farmhouse on Boone. It was a hit. Okay. So we're returning to the pizza, and I needed to free up this bowl for my stand mixer. So I just greased a glass mixing bowl and I put the pizza dough in it. And this is where I begin the stretch and fold process, just as I did with my loaves. So I kind of initially felt like it needed a little bit of attention. So I just kneaded it in that bowl from the start. And then about 3 times every 30 minutes, I returned to it and continued with those stretches and folds. And again, I think you can see kind of the gluten developing here. You can see the texture changing. At the same time, I was making another batch of sourdough loaves. I didn't film that since I showed you earlier in the week, but that's what's in that other bowl right there. I'm wanting to take some to our neighbors, but I really need my starter to be absolutely thriving before I do that. So working on it. And this, y'all, is the recipe I am most excited for. Cheez-Its. Sourdough Cheeze-its. I used the recipe for the sourdough crackers from Alexander's Kitchen that I made earlier in the week, and I just adapted it to make Cheez-Its. And the similarity is uncanny. These could be like a little bit cheesier. They don't look the same, like they definitely look different, but something about the sourdough and the tartness makes them taste so similar. So I'll have my additions to the recipe written out in the description box, but you follow the recipe for Alexander's Kitchen sourdough discard crackers, and you add about 1.5 cups of shredded sharp cheddar cheese. You're probably going to want to get it in there with your hands, but you're just going to mix it up really thoroughly. And yeah, here I am getting in with my hands. Once again, I wanted this to ferment. I wanted it to ferment for at least 12 hours. So it went in the fridge. I think I returned to it the next day. And here I am again, stretching and folding my pizza dough. I actually pulled it out at this point, and I'm going to shape 4 balls for 4 pizzas. So I use my bench knife, again, dividing it into 4 pieces. Hold on, I need a sip of my tea. Okay, returning. I shaped it into 4 balls, kind of doing the same process that I do with my loaves in terms of building that surface tension. And then I let them rest on the countertop, covered for about 30 minutes. And I stuck 2 cast iron skillets. This is how we like to make our pizza at home. Super simple. You get a really good result. I stuck them into the oven to preheat, and they preheated for about 20 minutes. They could have gone a little bit longer, but afterwards I pulled them out. I put a little bit of avocado oil on the bottom, and I try to work quickly here so that the pan is nice and hot, but I pull out a lump of dough at a time, and I'm just going to shape it into the shape of a pizza, and I'm going to fit that down into the bottom of the pan. We want to see it kind of like poof up a little bit, start to bubble up, and after you've placed it on the pan, you're again trying to work quickly because you want to keep the pan hot, get it into the oven as fast as possible. You're going to put your toppings on it. So Samuel started doing his. We did some just tomato sauce, and then I think on mine I put mozzarella cheese and shredded chicken. I put pineapple, onions, and mushrooms, and it was super tasty. I think this was probably the other biggest example in the week that showed me that my sourdough starter could use a little bit more TLC before it's at its optimal performance, we'll say, just because I'm used to seeing like bigger bubbles in the pizza crust itself. But regardless, it was delicious. And while anything sourdough does take time because of the fermentation, it's so easy to fit into your schedule. And if you just meal plan a little bit, like even just broadly have an idea of how you want to distribute your meals throughout your week, it's so easy just to plan ahead of time and have these fantastic sourdough goodies at your disposal. And it's honestly like a very affordable way to eat as well. Okay, next day, and it is time to finish the sourdough Cheez-Its. So fun fact, Cheez-Its are like my favorite snack, or at least up there as one of my favorite snacks in the whole wide world. But we were looking at the ingredients one time and realized they have even more vegetable oil in them than like kettle cooked potato chips do. So definitely wanted to find out a way to figure out a way to make these at home. As you'll see, I really am just repeating the process from the initial sourdough crackers that I made. I had a little bit more trouble figuring out how thick I wanted these to be and how long to bake them for, just because the cheese changed the color. So I found with these that I actually wanted them just a little bit thicker than the regular cracker recipe, and they aren't gonna get like completely dark. You can see kind of the ones in the middle there, like those big ones in the middle of the pan are probably the best example of like prime result. So just do your best to cut everything as, or rather roll out everything as evenly as possible. But we loved them, and actually as I'm recording this, there is another batch in the oven. Okay, so next day, and we are getting to the last recipe. This is a recipe for sourdough cinnamon rolls that I have returned to time and time again. They are perfect for like a special weekend occasion, maybe a holiday, or if you just want a cozy treat. You're gonna combine sourdough starter, sugar, melted butter, and some milk. I like to use my stand mixer for this one, and you start out with a paddle attachment. This dough is very, very soft. The recipe, which again will be linked below, the recipe has 2 versions. One is for like a softer dough that has more butter in it, and one is for a firmer dough. I don't know which one I like better, but this time I made the softer dough. I want to go back and make the other version again to kind of compare now that I've had the softer dough more recently. But you'll just notice it's like super, super, super moist and soft starting out. And this is one where you just need to have patience with it because it has so much butter in it. It's still, it's not too sticky. So feel it with your fingers before making a decision on like if you need to add extra flour or anything like that. So you start with your paddle attachment, you add the flour as you saw. I'm going to clean off the paddle, and that's going to sit for about 20 minutes, just covered and rest. This helps, again, kind of with that gluten development. After it's sat for about 20 minutes, you're going to return to it, but now you're going to put the hook attachment, the dough hook attachment on your stand mixer. And with that dough hook attachment, you're going to go ahead and mix it up for about 6 to 8 minutes, I think is what the recipe says. And this just really helps. Again, the number of times I've said like develop the gluten content, but that's really what this is all about. It helps with that. So you turn it up a little bit faster and you knead it for a little bit longer. So I covered this up, put it on the vent, and it fermented overnight. And then the next day, essentially, I think it was the next morning, I returned to it. And you roll it out and you just do, the classic simple cinnamon roll procedure. So you roll out your dough and then you melt some butter. You spread your butter over the dough, and then I had, cinnamon sugar, and I sprinkled the cinnamon sugar over the dough as well. Again, this is happening the next day. So while it looked like I just transitioned to rolling out the dough, this is like early the next morning. Okay, rolled it out, put the butter on it, put the cinnamon sugar on it. You want to super carefully roll it up. And then I tried cutting it with both a knife and with my bench knife, and using the bench knife definitely worked better for this one. I used just a cake pan and I lined it with some parchment paper. I then carefully arranged the cinnamon rolls into that pan. You could use a cast iron skillet as well. Anything, I think, round. You could even use a rectangular pan, but I love how like when you use a round pan, they all kind of snuggle up, and when they rise, it creates this beautiful cinnamon roll conglomeration. So put them all in the pan. I put the pan under the bathroom cabinet on the vent down there, and I left them. It ended up being a lot longer than the recipe said, again, because it's cold in my house and my sourdough starter is still waking up, but it ended up being about 8 hours. That's them before they proofed. I forgot to get a clip after they proofed, but before they baked, but they baked up beautifully. We took them up the mountain with us to go skiing, and it was supremely cozy. But that's it for today. Until next time. Bye, y'all.